I was born in a small town in Texas called Port Arthur in 1974. I was the only child of Richard Allen and Martha Parker. As a child, I spent lots of time to myself to think and reflect on life and the things around me. The city I grew up in had little industry outside of refinery work, which at the time was slowly going downward. There was a large degree of poverty and drugs in the area. This was the beginning of the crack cocaine epidemic, and I watched many people fall victim to the disease. My parents did a great job of working with what they were given. My father worked as a sewage plant operator for the city, earning approximately $17,000 per year. My mother stayed at home and watched children for extra income. I learned very early on that hard work would make me successful. I found hard work to be my escape. That was the arena where I felt complete peace. I literally spent hours thinking about what it would take for us to become wealthy. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out how people could financially live the lives that I'd seen on television. There were families with nice homes and multiple vehicles. They would vacation and do lots of activities. These families seemed to have a really positive attitude about everything. This lifestyle seemed so impossible based on my family's financial struggles. We were always trying to stay afloat. Ironically, I would often hear local folks say how good we had it, and that we were extremely lucky because my father had such a good job. I couldn't understand that if my father had such a good job, why were we always broke? Why were we always struggling? Why was there always such a high degree of negativity in the air? This question would spin through my head millions of times as a child. Although I had never seen or met a wealthy person, somehow I always felt like I would become wealthy. I would dream of being a scientist or an inventor. I was very good with electronics and would often take old toys off trash piles and open them up and take out batteries, motors, lights, etc. I would spend hours in my room tinkering with my findings until I created something worth showing off to my family. Often the invention would be some sort of robot whose body consisted of a small cardboard box. My cardboard creation would often be able to move forward and back with remote control taken from one of those old remote control cars with a wire between the car and the remote. The eyes would usually light up and the arms would spin. As a result of these events, I was soon labeled smart by my family. Smart was not the coolest thing to be through the eyes of neighborhood kids, so I rarely took my creations outside of the house. This was a label that I didn't need at the time. I was teased enough by my peers about my parents. My father was an alcoholic and my mother was an albino, meaning she had the appearance of a white person. Growing up in an all-black neighborhood, kids would often say that I was adopted and that my mother was white. I was teased about this a lot. They were also full of stories about seeing my father drunk, sleeping in the car, or driving off the road. My father was committed into an Alcoholics Anonymous program on 4 different occasions throughout my childhood for an average of 30 to 60 days each time. I had to take speech classes at school to help me correct the lisp in my speech. Basically, I couldn't say an S sound without sticking out my tongue. For some reason, I always felt like I didn't quite fit in with everyone around me. My self-esteem was very low and I always thought very little of myself. I rarely gave my parents any trouble. I often wondered why things seemed so wrong for me when I knew I was such a good person. I spent lots of time in church as a child and I had a very close relationship with God. I would often pray many times throughout the day. I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior at a very young age. My mother made me read my Bible pretty often, and people would often tell me that I would be a preacher one day. In the mid-'80s, I learned how to swim at a city pool a block or so away from my house. This pool was near an area of town that is since known as the Cuts of Short Texas. This is where you could find the drugs. This area always had heavy traffic back in those days. From the pool, you could watch people selling and smoking crack on a daily basis. Everyone in the city knew that if you had a friend or a family member who sold or smoked dope, you could always find him or her near this area. It was also not rare to witness a fight or see someone get stabbed or shot. Back in those days, shooting and stabbing didn't happen as often as fist fights, but I witnessed my share. My mother was very protective, so I knew if I told her what went on over there, she would have prevented me from going back. Me and the other kids that were good swimmers would often get to help clean out the debris that the dope fiends would throw in the pool during the night. We would usually retrieve empty wine bottles and beer caps. My mother was the oldest of 9 children. She had 7 brothers and a younger sister. My uncles were always more like older brothers to me. They taught me everything they knew about life. Most of them had their share of legal issues, and we watched drugs and prison rip my family apart. As we watched my uncle struggle with these issues as well as unemployment, I realized that if I were going to be successful in life, I would have to stay away from trouble with the law. I also watched how that first criminal record put them in a category that made them virtually unemployable, especially being in an area where jobs were limited. All of them had their own strong points, but one thing they could all do well was play ping pong or table tennis. I would love to stay over at my grandmother's house so I could play ping pong with them. Everywhere that I traveled later on in life, I was able to beat just about anyone in ping pong. When I was about 9, my older cousin Doug was murdered on the morning of his 16th birthday. He was about 6 years older than me, so needless to say, I looked up to him. I remembered going to his football games and eating with him at my grandmother's house, and now he was gone. I found myself paranoid of turning 16 from that point on. My parents would often fight a lot, and I would often find myself in the middle of the arguments. I would try my best to be somewhat of a mediator and try to bring peace to the household. I remember vividly counseling my father so he could say the right things to make my mother happy. Whenever someone in the house was down or depressed, it would make me feel down as well. I somehow always felt ultimately responsible for keeping the peace, even though I rarely gave my parents any trouble at all. I made all A's as an elementary student and was moved into an advanced program called Summit for my efforts. Somehow I always felt that if I could make my parents proud, they wouldn't have to fight anymore. I started in the Summit program in the 3rd grade. This was my first time going to class with kids of different races. This experience taught me lots of things. I never had to feel ashamed or guilty about being called smart anymore. I also found that compared to a lot of the other kids, I wasn't as smart as I thought I was. I learned right away that most of the kids in my class didn't have the financial difficulties that I had at home. This program often called for additional school supplies that were always a strain for us to buy. The kids in my class really liked me. I think it had a lot to do with the fact that I was a class clown. I think comedy kept me from focusing on the things that I had to deal with at home. One of my white friends would give me a quarter every day during lunch so I could have ice cream with him. I knew that my mother would have objected to me taking money from him, so I never told her until now. If you can remember being 9 or 10 years old, it was very hard to pass up dessert back then. I figured that I owe him about $30 and plan on giving it to him whenever I see him again. The class would go on field trips to places like museums, exhibits, and educational plays. I got a chance to visit places I never would have gotten an opportunity to see. Some of my classmates' parents were professionals like doctors and lawyers. I noticed that these kids concentrated on being kids and never thought about money matters. Money or the lack thereof was all I thought about. Every day I would dread about the moment the class would be asked for something that my family couldn't afford. As far back as I can remember, I had some sort of business working. I was really good.